La, la, la. Welcome once again to the Letterman Podcast. My name is Mike Chisholm. I am your host for this program, this show celebrating the life, body of work of David Letterman and company. I am excited to be here as always. This is a lot of fun for me. Right now, I'm shooting a separate intro for the Tom Dreesen episode. I've had some very cool conversations with Tom since we shot this. And you know what? Actually, not just Tom, but a lot of folks have reached out to me. I got to say, I'm blown away by the plethora of support that we have gotten here for this show. Hosting this is a dream come true for me. And I really enjoy the fact that so many people are starting to dig it already, and we're still in our infancy. I've had some really cool conversations with Tom. I appreciate the fact that so many people loved part one of Tom Dreesen. We're going to get to part two here right away. Part two is fantastic. We talk about all sorts of stuff. So if you remember, we finished the last episode talking about the strike, the Comedy Store, the early years, setting the table for Dave to jump on the broadcasting rocket that shot him into, in my opinion, the greatest broadcasting body of work the world has ever seen. We talk about the early show, moving into late night, and some of the differences between late night and late show, and it's a phenomenal conversation. The rest of the conversation, it's awesome. Going back and forth with Tom, one of the things that he said is, "Hey, don't be afraid to pull out some, couple minute clips of some of the things that he says," and he says some awesome stuff. He talks about the difference between Jay and Dave, and how in many ways, if it wasn't for Dave, Jay his career would not have gone the way it did, to say the least. He talked about Johnny Carson, and with full reverence and respect about how Dave helped keep Johnny hip. We're gonna isolate some of those videos and put them out there. And the fact that Tom would take the time to say, "Hey, why don't you do this? We're going to do that. It's going to happen." And just the care that he has. It's a dream come true conversation for me. I know I say it in the conversation with him, but I just want to reiterate how grateful I am for that. Hopefully you find it all entertaining. Now I do want to get to a little piece of business before we start part two with Tom Dreesen, the man, the myth, the legend himself, Tom Dreesen, my friend, Tom Dreesen. How cool is it to say that? And a member of the Letterman Podcast community. I want to be clear here. I am not a Letterman historian. There are folks out there who know way more than I do. Part of the reason I think I'm a suitable host for this thing is because I've got a massive enthusiasm, but at the same time, I was removed from the situation. And so there's a curiosity that comes with that. At least that's what a couple of people have told me, who enjoy this program so far. Now, there are going to be mistakes that are made. I have no problem owning up when something gets said wrong. We talked a little bit about, and when I talked to Tom, he talked about how many appearances he made compared to other folks, other comedians. That got muddled a little bit. Somebody has given me the true stats of things here. So appearances by a comedian on David Letterman's programs. Number one is George Miller. I like that. Rest in peace, my friend. I just feel like I would have been your friend if I would have known you. George Miller was awesome. 41 on late night and 16 on the late show. Tom Dreesen is number two at 43 appearances, 5 on late night and 37 on late show. And then 42 for Jake Johansson, and then Jay Leno, number 40. Was his number, all on late night. And we're going to get into that, of course, on the program, I'm sure, as we go through the life cycle of the Letterman Podcast. Hopefully we'll have a very long life cycle, and we've got some very cool things planned for you. But There we go. So that is important to throw that out there. Tom Dreesen, if you think about how many years Dave was on the air, the idea that Tom was on Dave's show in some form or another 43 times, my goodness, that just shows right there. That's a more than 1 a year average. And this episode that we get into now, we talk about a lot of stuff. You tell some Don Rickles stories. We talk about how he went overseas with Dave to perform for the troops. We talk about that. I tried really hard to come up with some things that would be a little bit different for the average fan or enthusiast, as I like to say. And I hope that we did that. The good news is, if we didn't, and there are some questions that are unanswered, we got Tom still, who is willing to come back and talk about this stuff. We've got some really neat ideas as to how we can bring him back and do some things here. So lots of cool things coming up with the Letterman podcast. We've got some post-mortem episodes coming up. Actually, Tom and I talk about Dave's new show. That's My Time with David Letterman on Netflix. I kind of go through the premise with it. I'm going to do a kind of a Letter Manifesto-ish aside to that, because that's where I got this signed, so again, Tom Dreesen claims to be his best friend. I got it in writing, but apparently so do a lot of other people, but that's okay. I'm in good company. I'm going to stop talking now, because you're not here to watch with your eyeballs or listen with your ear holes. Me talk. You're here to see or hear Tom Dreesen, and I would be too. And I just am very, very grateful for everybody. So without further ado, shall we start part 2 of Tom Dreesen's first appearance on the Letterman podcast? I hope you enjoy. Oh, by the way, God damn it, I fucked it up. I'm sorry about that. What I meant to say before was, with Tom giving me all the ideas of pulling videos out and things like that, I decided to take this entire conversation and leave it completely unedited. So what part 1, no edits whatsoever. Part 2, as soon as I shut up and start the good stuff, which is about to start, which I already introduced, and then I screwed up the introduction. Now I'm going to do it again. There's no edits there either. We're going to take chunks of this stuff and we're going to throw it out there. But as per Tom, he thought that was a good idea to do that, and I agree with him. But we left this entire thing, we just broke it into 2 chunks, and they're completely unedited. So just don't think that there's uncut stuff that you're not going to hear in this conversation with Tom. You're going to hear it all. I'm done talking now. Okay, without further ado, once again, part 2 of the first appearance of Tom Dreesen on the Letterman podcast. And this is where I wanted to segue over. You talked earlier about the Carson bump, how a comedian could show up on Johnny Carson and their career is made. It changed and it evolved through the years. I want to talk about Dave with that. I want to talk about late night and comedy showing up on comedians showing up on late night. And then you go to late show, guys like Chappelle, the greats now, Bill Burr, some of the real greats now that are in their prime got their start on late show. And then now, of course, you've got Joe Rogan, who the same thing happens. I've had on my other podcast, I've had a couple people who have guested on Rogan's podcast, and the Rogan bump is real too. It's very reminiscent of Johnny Carson. So I got lots of meat on this bone that you and I can talk about. Within a few years, Carson grooms, like you say, with a year, he replaces Tom Schneider, and he's got late night and the inmates running the asylum, everything. Dave, of course, bringing his friends on the show all the time. You guys must have had a ball doing that, and a different kind of comedian could show up. There was only 1 or 2 comedians, I think, if I have it right, only 1 or 2 comedians that could make the jump and be on Carson and on Letterman. Mostly it was a different crowd. A different type of comedian would be on late night than would be on Carson. Am I right about that?
Yeah, but you left out one thing.
Yes, sir.
David, before he got to the following Johnny, NBC gave him a morning show.
Well, of course, yes. The David Letterman show is phenomenal as well. Yeah.
It was phenomenal, but it wasn't right for morning.
Yes.
And David, it didn't work, and they took him off the air. And David was at the lowest I've ever seen him in all the years I've known him.
Oh, I'm glad we're talking about this. This is awesome.
Him and we jogged together. We, worked out together, and I spent a lot of time with him because he needed a friend at that time. In fact,
and this is when he stopped drinking too, right?
Yeah, that too. When I went to Tahoe to perform in Lake Tahoe, and he went up there with me, and we had breakfast together. We go jogging. We go breakfast. We'd hang out together. I do my shows. He'd come and sit in the wings. He just needed somebody a friend to be there for him at that time. And he really thought that it was over, that he had his shot and that shot was over. But it wasn't true. And as you know, he came back and did the Late Show, and all the rest was a success. But I forgot your question.
No. It's good. I'm glad you brought up the morning show, and I because it's an important piece of comedy. You got guys like Conan O'Brien and some of these other comedians out there who were like, "What the heck is this?" And how many people it was a 6-week run or something like that, and it's inspired so many people. And then of course, the show ends. He thinks, life is over, but he still had a holding deal. It's not like NBC wasn't still interested.
Yeah, but
he needed to figure it out, right?
It was Brendan Tartikoff who really believed in him.
Yeah,
that he wasn't gonna. They were gonna try something else, and it was perfect. And then Johnny Carson owned that second show.
Yes,
and Dave was under contract with them. And it was the right thing to do. But you're right, David, because David was a little more quirky and zanier than Johnny, would have on that type of comedian or that kind of show, that the craziness of David Letterman, and the quirks of him. But the interesting thing is that Johnny Carson, Jay Leno did the Tonight Show, and he did okay.
Sure.
Johnny wasn't crazy about him, and he didn't get on anymore. And I always say, this is my opinion, Johnny Carson's nightclub act in Las Vegas, I saw it several times. He had a real funny bit. He had some funny bits, but one of his routines was about why do UFOs always land in the swamps in Mississippi, and the only people who see it are Ike and Spike, Billy Joe and Billy Bob were the ones who saw it. If they really after, why don't they land in Times Square or something like that? Johnny did that bit. Jay went on the Tonight Show and did a bit just like that. And I personally, this is my opinion, no one's ever told me, but when I know how comedians are, and I think Johnny somehow wasn't crazy about that idea, and Jay wasn't getting back on. However, Dave and Jay were friends, and David Letterman always said Jay Leno's the funniest stand-up comedian in the world. He really is. I've seen Jay do 2 hours and never tire, never repeat him. I'm just funny stuff. But in fact, we would be at the Comedy Store, George Miller, me, David, Jeff Altman. We'd be all outside talking, and Gavin, they'd say, Jay's going on, and we'd run inside to watch Jay. It's always fun to watch Jay. But David starts putting Jay on.
Yeah. And
David puts Jay on all the time. And David launched Jay's career, in my opinion. What's your beef? Remember that little hook they had there?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Well, the thing that the panel with those two was amazing because, it's almost like watching fencing, because I watched a lot of those episodes and those appearances, and I mean, there's the canned stuff and where you come on there and that the panel is just set up for the material, set the volleyball spike. But the problem is Dave wouldn't always set the volleyball. Sometimes he would spike it right back just to see Jay's reaction, and you'd see Jay almost be taken back, and it was almost, they talk about how it was dangerous, and I love that word a little bit because it was the sparring was phenomenal. And I just loved watching that. And to this day, I'll still watch it, and it holds up. Now we're in 2022. The fact that those sparring matches can hold up in 2022 is quite remarkable.
Well, and again, they both had respect for one another, and that's what was fun to watch, that going back and forth, of course. But again, I believe Jay knows that David was the one to launch him, and then from there, Johnny started using him. And also. And I say this in all honesty, and people who are in the know it's right. There were a lot of very clever things that David was doing that all of a sudden Johnny was doing similar things, similar things to take over what David was doing.
Sure.
David is some real creative stuff, But again, it was dangerous, and a lot of people at first were afraid to go on. People who were shy, and actors and actresses that are prima donnas and being pampered and treated like your royalty wherever you go. They would come on David's show, and you better be ready. If you could handle it, David, if you could handle it, and a lot of women would come on that show and say, I don't want to do it anymore. And then a lot of women come on that show and scored because they go right back at Dave, and that's what he wanted.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. He wanted game day players who were ready to mix it up a little bit.
Well, if you want to succeed in a profession that's been around for 100 years, there's one thing: if you hope, you're different.
Yes. Be
different. If you can be different, there's a lot of things that talk show hosts have done. But David, you have to admit, was different. And
God, yeah.
Because he was dangerous, because he'd say, Jack Klugman one time when I was on the Tonight Show, he said to me, and I had done like 60 Tonight Shows, but he started describing to me, I watch you comedians go out there and you walk out there in front of this audience and you're like naked, you're like walking a tightrope, and the audience is waiting for you to fall off. Could you fall? He started describing it to me. I said, am I glad I didn't meet you when I first started out? I'd have been afraid to go on tonight. But that's what that's what David's show was. Yep. It was, you watch, because Dave, again, the difference that I said earlier, and it bears repeating. If you watch Jay Leno, you wanted to know who the guests were, or any talk show. When you watch David Letterman, you didn't give a damn who the guests were. No, the show was why you tuned in, and it was everything. It was him being the epicenter of that, and all of the things that went on around him. And I love that you just said this. I've never really I've said a lot of things and had a lot of talks with all sorts of folks about Dave and the impact he made. And I've got a huge thing about the idea about him moving over to CBS, and it was one of the best things that ever could have happened. And I mean, there's all sorts of things, but one thing I've never considered before, and I love that you brought it up, is that Dave helped keep Johnny a little bit younger and a little hipper. And I think about that because I think about all the appearances where Dave even just showed up on Johnny's show, and how the audience would go apeshit when Dave would show up. And they did their skits with Johnny stealing his truck and bringing on Judge Wapner and doing all the things that they did. And then, of course, at the end, when the switch was happening, not just the last appearance, but the second last appearance, and when shit was making the news and all of the turmoil was happening, Dave would still show up on that show. And you're exactly right. Dave helped keep Johnny hip. And that is a really, really good point that I'm very grateful you brought up today. That's really insightful, Tom. In Johnny's defense, after 30 something years, what haven't you done and done and done and done?
Yes.
So anytime you see, that's a new idea, that's a spark for a new idea, again. And by the way, most people who are going to sit up and watch Johnny Carson are not going to be awake when David came on.
No, that's right.
Very few people are going to sit through both. I knew when kids in college would tell me when I was doing college campuses, doing college circuit around the country, they'd say, I tape David Letterman. I can't stay up that late.
Right.
I've got to study. I got to be in school class. But I tape them and I make sure that I get a chance. And sometimes like 6 or 7 of them would get in the room and watch David,
Well, and I've told this story a few times to anybody who will listen. For me, I would listen for my dad. I didn't come from money either, and we had one TV in the house in the family room, and I would drink water, and drink lots of water before I went to bed because I wanted to wake myself up when I could hear my dad turning off the TV just after Johnny, or maybe after he watched the monologue, and then he would go upstairs, and I would get up because we didn't have a VCR back then. I was in elementary school, junior high, and I would walk to the TV and I would turn on. It had those big thick. It was one of those big thick tube TVs, and I would sit an inch in front of it with the volume so low you could barely hear it, just so I could watch late night. The radiation from that probably explaining why I am the way that I am as an adult. It was a little bit rock and roll, and then when the VCR came out, of course, tape it every single night and all that stuff. But Dave was rock and roll, and Johnny was big band. And I think that the audiences I have reverence for Johnny Carson, total reverence. My dad had reverence for him, and right there alone, that gives it, the translation is made. But for me, Dave was rock and roll, and he stayed rock and roll right to the end of the Late Show run for me. I just appreciate that vantage point, though, that you just came from. I want to talk about when the transition happened. I don't want you to tell tales out of school. This isn't a show about scandals and things like that. But at the end of the day, a defining moment in broadcasting and all of TV. No one had ever come and competed with the Tonight Show. Of course, at the time, Dave didn't know how it was going to end. But at the end of the day, you were there when Dave went through one of the most public, taking of a chance that anybody has ever done in trying to build a new franchise, one that is trying to do what no franchise has ever done, and that is survive against the Tonight Show. You were there when the transition happened. I know that, I don't know when your first Late Show appearance was, but during the turmoil, when that was all happening and Dave was working his ass off, filming all these remotes, just busting it to make NBC eat their words and eat their deeds. What was that like from your vantage point?
You mean when Dave went to CBS?
At the time when that was all happening, when the turmoil was happening and then the decision was made, what was your take? What was your opinion about that time?
This is my opinion. This is strictly my opinion.
Yes, sir.
About that. And I'm trying to move over here so I get more light. It seems like I'm in the darkness here, but.
Oh, you look great over here, man.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
Anyhow, this is my opinion. Warren Littlefield was the president of NBC at that time.
Yes.
I'm going to digress. I once took a video. I hosted a show in Chicago, and this isn't about me. This isn't about David, but I'm trying to make it so you'll understand.
Feel free to make it about you, man. Yeah, all good.
But I hosted a talk show in Chicago. They gave me Oprah Winfrey's studio at ABC in Chicago. Oh. She was going on hiatus for a week, and they gave me 1 week. A guy named Joe Ahern was president of ABC at that time. He said, "I'm going to give you 1 week. Show me what you do if you had your own late night talk show." And wow. And I did 1 week, and had a great week. We were on the last half hour of Johnny and the first half hour of Dave, just in the Chicago market. And anyhow, the show went good. It's a long story, but wow. I took video of that to Brandon Tartikoff. Long time ago, they had Peter Lasalle called my manager after I did about 5 Tonight Shows and said, "We'd like Tom to guest host sometime. We'd like to groom him for that." Sure. And I was very excited about that. And I made a dumb mistake. I was so excited about that. I went and I told Doc Severinson's manager. Boy. We were sitting around in a restaurant and he was one of his clients. And I said, "Hey, they're talking about me getting guest host with Tonight Show." And he evidently went back to Johnny and said, "Dreesen's bragging about the fact that he's going to take over the Tonight Show." I no more said that than the man in the moon. But all of a sudden, I could be on the Tonight Show. And as I told you, I did 61 Tonight Shows, but I didn't guest host. And one night, Fred DeCordova put me behind the desk. Bert Convey was hosting. And when they went to commercial break, he said, "I got to pee so bad." Fred DeCordova said, "Go and don't worry about coming back." He put me behind the desk. He said, "Tommy, you introduce the next guest. Like you've been here all night long. Don't say," "That's funny. Bert's gone to the John." So I said, "We're back now." And my next guest, and it was a girl singer, Anyhow. So
that's a great moment.
Yeah, great moment. Now, flash forward. I've done about 45 Tonight Shows, 59. So I brought this tape to Brandon Tartikoff. I had a 15-minute meeting with him, and I showed him the beginning, middle, ending, and he said, "Tommy, it's a great show." I met Brandon when he was in Chicago as a writer on that same station. Now he's head of the network, on NBC. So now he's head of NBC. And I said, "I would like to guest host the Tonight Show. I'd like to be considered to be a guest host." Not that was before David and before any talk. I mean, David was already established at NBC New York. And anyhow, Brandon said to me, he said, "Tom, I think you'd make a great guest host, but I have no authority over the Tonight Show. That's our show. NBC owns it. That's our show. Yep. I have no Johnny Carson. If I want to get somebody from a sitcom, one of our sitcoms on NBC, Sally Snodgrass or whatever her name is, sure, on that show, because the ratings aren't good, I would call Johnny would never take my call. Peter Sally or Fred DeCorda would say, "What is it, Brandon? I'd like to get Sally Snodgrass on the show because we need to boost the ratings." This is the head of the network. He said, and I'd get a call back in an hour or two. Johnny doesn't like her, thinks she's an airhead or whatever.
Right.
Now, or doesn't like him, whoever it was, a guy maybe.
Sure.
But if it was somebody he liked. Now, so in other words, this is the head of the network asking to have a guest on a show they own. But that's how much power Carson had.
Yes.
Now, Warren Littlefield has got a choice. This is all my opinion now. None of this, I never discussed this with Dave or with Jay or anybody.
Yep.
If you asked Johnny Carson to do something, he didn't want to do it, you had to go through the court of it. If you asked Jay Leno, when Jay Leno started guest hosting the Tonight Show,
yep,
he would go all across the land to all the O&Os, the owned and operates, like 5, 6 O&Os.
Talk to the affiliates.
And he'd go meet the general manager and shake hands with him. Hi, I'm Jay Leno. I guest host that once in a while. He was
master networker.
He was going to be this teamwork and this team player and this networking guy.
Yep.
And Dave, would you come in and would you fly overnight and get no sleep at all and do an hour and a half for the NAPTI convention or the NBC affiliates? He was on his way there.
Yep.
Now, Warren Littlefield has a choice. He's going to take over. He's going to the Tonight Show, and he has a choice of getting a guy like Dave Letterman, who really was right for that job. There's no question that he was right for the job, and David wanted the job. And this guy who's a real team, David Letterman was a lot like Johnny Carson.
Yep.
And this is my opinion. This is my opinion. David might argue with me. I never brought it up with David, but I always feel that choice wasn't made because who is the best for it. The choice was made, but who's going to work with me?
Exactly.
I'm the head of the network.
Who's going to play ball?
Yeah, and I don't want to have to. If I want Dave to do something, I don't want to have to talk to his assistant.
Yes.
They called Jay directly and told Jay, this is what we want you to do and all that stuff. Which was to his credit. But anyhow, that's my opinion of what was going down at that time. Now, when it happened, I think, like you just said, I think the greatest thing that ever happened was Dave was going to CBS.
100%. Totally.
By the way, he was killing them in the ratings. He was the king of late night at that time.
Which the deck was stacked against him. He on paper shouldn't have been able to be as successful as he was, and a lot of people don't realize that. And it was when CBS, NFL football and the landscape changed and stacked the deck even more against him when that shifted. But the fact, and this is the part where I come back into it. And again, all the respect to Mr. Leno, all the respect to him. He talks about being number one and then number one when he left and all that stuff. The fact of the matter is there was never any competition for the Tonight Show. Never mind saying, oh, well, we're still number one. No. Before then, no franchise could even touch the Tonight Show. And not only did Dave set up his little castle across the street and start ramparting the hell out of that franchise, but he competed, and not only competed, many, if not most, or a lot of folks out there would say the superior product. And if CBS didn't give Dave the deal that they gave him with the ownership of 1230 and all that, we wouldn't have all of the franchises that we have now. And Dave might have been the guy as TV expanded and Comedy Central and all these other networks showed up and the dilution sort of happened. Dave might have been the guy to lose the strength of the Tonight Show. So I go deep on this subject because the fact of the matter is Dave actually competed against the Tonight Show. That alone is the hallmark in my mind.
And what turned it around was Jay was his ratings were in the dumper.
Yep.
What turned it around, and he was trying out new things, and the O.J. Simpson stuff and the judge,
yep. Dancing Itos.
Yeah, and all that kind of stuff. What turned it around was Hugh. What's his name? Hugh O'Brien.
Hugh Grant. The night that it changed was Hugh Grant admitting to the tomfoolery on Hollywood Boulevard.
The tomfoolery. He picked up a hooker, and that's a nice name for a tomfoolery. Anyhow, it's all interesting. It was all a lot of hard time, tough times. And by the way, that's the other problem. You go through that, and Dave's a fighter. He's I tell you, I played sports against him. He's not a wuss.
Yeah.
He's not a wuss. He'll make you think that, okay, but once a game starts, he wants to win. So that took a lot of hours and stress, and through the years of trying to get, fighting to be on top. When you look back all over it, you think about, oh my God, how much of life did I miss?
Yeah.
I never was on that level, but I still was out there with a wife and 3 kids, and I was out there night after night, missing birthdays, missing graduations, because I had to get that money for the rent money. And that takes a lot of wear and tear on you over the years, and especially late night ratings. Oh my God, you got to get in every morning and find out what the numbers were, and what, and you're pouring over the guests, and they want, this person wants to be on, you want that person on, but you can't get them. I mean, that kind of stress, day in and day out, day in and day out, year in and year out. It takes a lot of wear and tear on you. And as you know, David had open heart surgery. I guest hosted the show when he had the shingles one time. And most people get the shingles on their chest, which is painful as hell.
Oh, they're awful.
David had it over his right eye. So there's a lot to be said. And then you got to go out and be funny every night.
Yeah.
All that, and top of that, you got to go out and be funny. I always think of that song that Sinatra sang, "My Way."
Oh yeah.
And at the end of your life, there's one line in that lyric when you look back and you say, "To think I did all that, and may I say, not in a shy way, oh no, not me, I did it my way." David exemplifies that. But if I said that to him right now, he'd be saying, "Oh yeah. What's your Cubs doing?" He would change the subject.
Well, and to his credit, when it comes to that, that's probably the thing that drove him to be great and to do things better and to reinvent himself, and to not accept that praise, is kind of him taking one for the team and continually making a better reinvented product for guys like me, the people who just admire it so much. I just wish for even a moment he could see himself through my eyes, and not just mine, but an entire community of folks, the people who worked for him, et cetera, who we've talked about. I want to talk a little bit about Late Show. The question that I have, I've got so many, and maybe one day, hopefully one day I can get you back and we can talk, because I literally could do all the time that we have done up to this point, completely new material, and we could do it again. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate you giving of your time. I just want to touch on a couple Late Show things, and then I got a Sinatra question for you. But I have seen comedians at the Comedy Cellar, and then a couple nights later see them on the Late Show, and I see their set at the Cellar mimicked at the Late Show, but on panel. So I literally watched I've watched an Amy Schumer set at the Cellar, which killed. She went on as a guest doing panel with Dave, and almost word for word her material from the Cellar, just in the form of Dave asking her questions, again setting the volleyball for spikes, with a little bit of here and there added to it with Dave's wit. My question for you is this: the nights that guys like you were on, you and the crew from back in the day, was there that much preparation where it was panel, that repartee, or was it just, hey, Tom, it's great to see you. This is a night off for me. Let's go out there and catch up. What do you plug in? Okay, let's just go have some fun. Or was it a little bit of both for you?
Well, a little bit of both. David liked it. For David, it was, let's have fun. And I don't care where you're going. I may jump over and go in a totally different direction, and you better be ready,
Sure.
You never knew what Dave was going to do. But let me say this. Part of the things I teach new comedians is I write on a blackboard, and I'll say, if you don't remember anything I'm telling you, remember this: conversation, not presentation.
Oh,
I say, is it your act? You damn right it's your act. It's your job to make it look like it's not an act. So so when you walk out on stage every night, it's like you're walking into your living room, like your wife said to you, I got 22 people in the living room, dinner isn't ready yet, will you do me a favor? Or
Stall.
if you're a comedian, your husband's the chef, or whatever it is, but they say, will you do me a favor? Go tell them some of them stories about you going to Vancouver or wherever you're from. They're telling them, Your mommy, remember those funny, now you walk into your living room and you say, dinner's going to be ready in about a half hour. But let me tell you, when I was growing up, I got to tell you a story. And is it your act? Yes, but it's your job to make it look like it's not an act. So Amy Schumer preparing all that stuff, then she sits down and it becomes a conversation, not a presentation. You make it look like an act, then it looks like an act, so that's part of it. Now with me, I would go on, like any talk show you go on, the talent coordinator who books you, or who is they put in charge of you at that time, will say, they'll call you ahead of time. Tom, what do you want to plug? I say, well, I'm appearing at the Radio City Music Hall or wherever. And then I'll say, give me some questions. Say, okay, tell Dave to ask me about, and I'd have a story about that. Okay? Yeah. But I always was prepared that David would ask a story, he tried to make me tell a story one night how I almost got in a fist fight with Tommy Lasorda when Lasorda was, many, many years ago. I mean, you didn't know where he was going to go with you. Right. And that was the fun of it, and that's the fun of it when you sit there. I had dinner with him in New York. I was in New York a couple of weeks ago doing a show. And then we went to Greenwich Village. He and I and Paul Schaefer went to dinner, and we sat around, and that's the way it was, sitting around telling stories again about when we went to Iraq and what happened in Iraq. I
was going to ask you about going overseas with Dave. That was literally one of my next questions. Because you went overseas with it. This is powerful Dave, who did cool shit like that and big shit. You went over to Iraq with him.
Well, I spent 40 something hours in the air. I went from here, LA, to New York. Then we got on David. We had a private jet, took us to Kuwait, and then from Kuwait we got on these huge aircraft. Oh God, why am I blanking?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about though. The big guy.
And anyhow, and going from base to base, Al Tagadam and Fallujah and Kuwait, all these bases we were performing at. So we talked about that. And by the way, then we had to fly all the way back, and I would get off in New York and go to LA. I was 40 something hours in the air. I was a zombie for like 3 days afterward,
Yeah.
But we had such a great time being with Paul, and Biff went with us too. And
that's awesome.
I got pictures on my office wall. I should send you that. I'll send you a picture of that too.
Please do. Yeah, I would appreciate that so much.
By the way, and what I loved was David would walk out. He wanted me to do the stand-up comedy, but David would go out and he said, Tom, I'm not going to do stand-up. But he would say funny things that would have the people just cracking up, and they adored him. I mean, they all knew, obviously, were fans.
Sure.
I never forget. We land in this godforsaken place. First of all, in Kuwait, then we take the C-130s into Fallujah, and he walks out in front of all these military guys, and he goes, David Letterman, they're all cheering. He goes, hey, anybody here from out of town? Well, I mean, his opening line, and then he was throwing footballs to some of the guys. He had a bag full of footballs. But what I told him at dinner, what impressed me was he wasn't throwing floppers; he was throwing spirals.
Oh yeah,
a
cannon. Absolutely.
Yeah, because he's athletic. Anyhow, he would never admit that he's athletic, but he is. Yeah.
Oh man. Okay. Okay. I got a question from actually one of Dave's longtime staff members, who was a friend of mine. Like literally he was 31 years of the 32-year run he worked for him. That had a question. He's really one of the only people that I told that I was doing this. So that the story that you were talking about earlier, don't tell anybody. Today, that was my day. I'm not telling anybody. I got Tom fucking Dreesen on my podcast tonight. I was just, it was a too good to be true moment for me. But this is one of the guys that I did tell. And I asked him if he had any insights or questions that might be off the beaten trail a little bit. And so this one here it's a really good question in my mind as an enthusiast. Don Rickles. So one of the things that Don would do when he came to New York to be on the show is he would rent a big room and dinners. And there was always that joke about how Dave wouldn't go or would go for dinner with the guests and all that kind of stuff. Well, that stuff didn't really apply with Don, and how he would get a room and there would be a gathering of all sorts of folks. And the staffer asked me to say, okay, well, ask Tom if he was ever part of one of those evenings with Don, and if there's any Don Rickles stuff that comes to mind when what comes to mind when I mention that.
I spent a lot of time with Don. I mean, Don, before I ever, even met Frank, I did the Dean Martin roast with Don, and I, I did charity shows with him and stuff like that. And then when I was touring with Frank, I mean, Frank would have house parties and stuff like that Don would be at, and just he'd be ripping everybody. He just was. Don was Don 24/7. Most people, most comedians off stage have their serious side and sometimes very quiet and very shy. Some are more a continuation of themselves, and Don was funny all the time. I don't know whether it was a manic thing with him. He felt he always had to be. Rarely was he ever serious about anything. Rarely. I remember one night he was talking to Barbara Sinatra, and Frank was trying to get his attention. I was sitting next to Frank, and Frank was asking me something. He said, "Oh, Don would know." He goes, "Don, Don, Don, Don," and Rickles just kept talking to Barbara Sinatra. Yeah, Barbara. And Frank's over here going, "Don, Don," and finally Don turned around and he said, "Frank, leave me alone. I'm talking to somebody who's coming into a lot of money."
That's a perfect Don Rickles joke. Oh my God!
The classic story, and I don't want to bore anybody, but it's been told 10 million times.
It's my show. I don't give a shit. I'm not bored at all, and I don't think the audience is going to be either. You go, man.
Well, it's a classic Don Rickles, Frank Sinatra story that Frank would tell. Frank told me the story before I ever heard it from Don. But Frank said he met Don Rickles when Don was a new comedian many, many, many years ago. Don wasn't married at the time. Shows you how long ago it was. Yeah. He was just a new comedian, and Frank met him like one time. Now, Frank was in like Patsy's restaurant in New York on West 57th Street. And he was over in the corner. Rickles was in the restaurant with a young girl that he was dating at the time.
Sure.
And that's how long ago it was.
Yep.
And the girl looks over his shoulder and said, "Oh my God, there's Frank Sinatra." And Rickles had only met Frank like one time. He was going, he said, yeah, Frank comes in here all the time. She said, "You know Frank Sinatra?" He said, "Yeah, I know Frank." She said, "If I could meet Frank Sinatra, I would do anything." And she reached across the table, she squeezed his hand and said, "Anything." So Rickles gets up nervously and goes up and said, "Frank, he said, hi, Don." He said, Rickles said, "Frank, there's a girl I'm sitting with, a big fan of yours. It'd mean a lot to me if you'd say hello to her." And he said, "Well, I'm finishing my meal now, and when I pay the check, I'll come over, say hello." And Frank would tell the story this way. He said, "I got up, and rather than go, in those days, you went to the front to pay the check." He said, "I got up and I walked across the room, clear across the room, and I walked over to the table where Rickles was sitting with the girl. And I said, 'Hi, Don.' And he looked up and he said, 'Not now, Frank. Can't you see I'm with somebody?'" Frank said, "I wanted to take his head and shove it in the soup."
That is a phenomenal moment.
A million times.
I love that story. Again, like you said, not the first time, but every time I hear that story, it harkens back and it brings up nostalgia and all sorts of the cool feelings inside of a different time of show business. And I love that. I'm going to get to the question here that shout out to Rob Cates. Rob Cates. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I want to point out something.
Please.
David Letterman right there.
Okay.
Frank Sinatra would laugh about that story. My definition, the greatest gift that God can bestow upon a human being is a sense of humor. Now, a sense of humor is not when you have the ability to laugh at others' shortcomings or misfortunes. It's when you have the ability to laugh at your own. Mm-hmm. If you can laugh at yourself and all the dumb things that you've done, people will love you for it and they want to be around you. That's the greatest gift that God can bestow upon you, is be able to laugh at yourself. Mm-hmm. One time I was on Hollywood Squares, and I'm going to get back to Letterman. I was on Hollywood Squares, and the question was, of 3,500 women polled, what's the number one characteristic they look for in a man? And it was a sense of humor. A guy who didn't take himself too serious. Women say, "Oh, I love being with him. He makes me laugh. He always has a joyful look at, no matter how dark things get." Now, David Letterman, in my opinion, has a great sense of humor.
Sure.
Dave would laugh at himself before anybody does. Dave would point out to you some dumb thing that he did and then share with you. And I did, that was another thing that was charming about him.
Yeah.
David had a Midwestern quality. I've always thought that the best talk show hosts, most of the best talk shows came from the Midwest.
Yep.
Because Midwestern quality wears well over a long period of time on TV. Mike Douglas came from the Midwest. Phil Donahue came from the Midwest. Johnny Carson.
Johnny, yeah.
Dick Cavett came from the Midwest. I'm leaving out people. Oprah Winfrey came from the Midwest. You know, and there were others like New Yorkers and stuff that lasted a long time. But David had that Midwestern. Look, Johnny Carson, when he walked out, he was the star. He was a star. When he walked out, people got chills. Oh, Johnny Carson, he did his monologue. When he went with Ed McMahon, did some bits, he was a star. But after that, you were the star. I don't care if you're an old guy from, an old woman from Oklahoma who brought a chicken on the show, whatever it was, you were the star. You were a guest in his home, you know, and that's what I felt with David when I was with David. It was your turn now. You know, you're the star when you come out, but then it's your turn to turn it over. And don't be afraid to poke fun at yourself, and don't take yourself too seriously.
This is advice for me as I build this this new show, and I appreciate that, and I can definitely relate to it. You know, you don't ever want to come across high and mighty. Come across humble and a bit of a doofus, and I'm very good at doing, especially the doofus part. I'm very good at that. Hey, there was apparently one time Frank was going to do a walk on to the Late Show, but he had a nap and he fell asleep instead. Were you with him at that point?
Yeah, but you know, there's another thing that pisses me off, and this always sounds like, oh yeah, well, I came up with it. But I originally said to Frank years ago, I said, what I'd like to do is go on David, and I talked to David about it. I'd love to go on David's show and have David say to me, you know, after doing a little monologue, have Frank in the wings. But David said, yeah, but Tom, tell the truth. Tell the truth. Frank's, you know, I used to say it's Frank's world and we're living in it, you know, but Frank's the boss. I'd say, well, David, that may be true, but not with me. Not with me, because I'm my own boss. I mean, I'm you know, Frank's who he is, but I'm my own boss. And then Frank would step out and say, hey, come on, we're late for dinner. I'd say, Dave, I got to go, you know. That would have
been a great bit.
Yeah, that's the bit I wanted to do, you know. Well, that was later on. I, like the big mouth I am, I talked about that a lot backstage and when I was with Frank and everybody. Anyhow, now they were going to do that with Rickles, you know.
Right.
They were going to do that with Rickles, but Frank didn't.
He fell asleep, right? He was taking a nap, and they said, no, I'm going to have a nap.
If that's the story they tell, you know, when it's showtime, Frank would show up. If Frank didn't want to do it, he didn't want to do it. And, you know, I always like the people who used to say about Frank, you know, they kept him on too long and you know, like his wife made him work till the end, even when he shouldn't have worked. Bullshit. Frank Sinatra did what he wanted to do when he wanted to do it. You're going to take this guy that you talk about, I did it my way and all, and you're going to say they drug him out there and made him perform the last 2 years. Bullshit. He wanted to perform. You know, I would watch this guy when he's 78 years old and it's time to go on stage, and you always left him alone before he went on. And for about 5 minutes, he'd pace and you'd say, oh, this poor old guy, and geez, he should be home with his grandchildren and just kicking back and enjoying his life. And he, you know, the orchestra was starting, and he'd walk out there and that light would hit him and 20 years would fall off his face. Come fly with me. Let's fly away. And after the show, the excitement he felt when we'd go to dinner and say, wow, man, that's a great show tonight. Yeah, they came to play, Tommy. It was a good night. You know, you know, he wanted to work that long. He really did.
Okay, so Rob Cates runs a David Letterman page on Facebook that has thousands of members. He also has a Rat Pack page. Shout out to Rob Cates. Hey, buddy. He had a question here for you about Frank. Favorite and least favorite songs for Frank to perform in the later years. Now, I'm thinking that based on what you just said, Frank didn't do anything he didn't want to do. Were there any songs where he was like, like I didn't want to do the song? And were there any that he was just still had that extra juice for, even up to the end?
The last 7 years of our tour, I was with him 14 years. His son, Frank Jr., was the conductor. And Frank Jr. laid out the music every night, but to his dad's approval. Frank would come in the dressing room before the show. He'd lay out the songs and say, Dad, this is what I laid out for you tonight. And if Frank said, I don't want to do that tonight, you know, something else. One of the toughest songs I thought was from My Boy Bill. You know, what was that Broadway play? Was it Oklahoma? Whatever. It was whatever it was. But that was it's called the soliloquy.
The soliloquy.
That was a tough song for Frank to sing. You know, at the end, it was like, I'll go out and take and steal a little bit, and I'll die. Thank God. You know, whatever it is. You know,
show tunes that kind of go all over the place and
big
are busy.
And it was exhausting, you know, but So, but I don't remember him. I mean, there might have been that a couple of times. For the most part, he accepted what his son laid out for him, and he would go do it. It was a joy to watch. To sit in the years I sat in the wings and watched Sammy Davis Jr., and it was like show business 101. The years I sat with Dean Martin, I performed with Dean Martin shows and Frank. I mean, all these artists that I work with, it was like going to school. The way they command of a stage. I learned so much from them. When you walk out, this is our stage. You own this stage. I always say, young artists today, young singers and stuff, they try to electrify an audience with a lot of laser lights and all that stuff.
Yes.
Sinatra, Sammy Davis, and Dean Martin were laser lights.
Oh.
I saw Frank walk out in front of 40,000 people. He in 20,000, all the arenas, he'd walk out and just in a moment, singing a song, he would bring it all down right here. That guy in the furthest seat, way up in the audience, felt like he was in a bar and Frank was singing to him.
Oh my God.
They had that skill. It was magic.
Charismatic charisma that is just beyond measure, and special human beings have that. I'm a guy who believes David Letterman has that, by the way. As I bring us home here, I'm gonna do something a little bit different than what we normally do. The normal way that I end this podcast, and goddamn, I sure don't want to end it, but we're gonna, and I'm gonna ask. It would be great if you could be on again. I'd love to have you.
I only did 2 hours. So.
Oh my man, I appreciate that. I'm a marathon man. I could do this all day too. The normal way that we end the podcast is we talk a little bit about my next guest. I love that he has talked about Tom Schneider earlier. I love how Dave has reinvented himself over the years, and now he's into the long form. I loved Tom's long form, and Dave's doing it now, and it's very cool to see that. And I always ask the question, if there's 3 people that you would like to see Dave interview on my next guest, who would they be? But that's not what I'm going to do with you tonight, Tom. I had the good fortune a few weeks ago to see Dave at his new show, and the format of the new show. And again, I love it. I fucking love it so much. It's Dave giving back to new stand-ups and giving new stand-ups an opportunity to share in Dave's limelight. And again, watching him come out on stage, he shot 3 episodes in front of me. He came out, did a monologue, a new stand-up came out, did 10 minutes and did maybe 5 to 10 minutes of panel with Dave. And then Dave did that 3 times. He went and changed wardrobe and he came out, new monologue, new comic, and he did that 3 times. And I just thought that was amazing. But here's my question for you. If there, and number 1 is going to be you, that's going to be the answer. If there were 3, never mind the up and coming comics. If there were 3 comics that you would like to see do this with Dave, past, present, whoever. Now, obviously you're number 1. If we're going to see Dave, come out, do a monologue, please welcome Tom Dreesen. And Tom comes out, does a thing. You guys do some panel. To me, that is a phenomenal night of TV. I'm in. Who are the other 2?
First of all, thank you for that. I would love to do 1 hour with Dave with no script, no nothing. Just him.
I would love it too.
Just going all over. I would love to do that. An hour. I do 2 hours because I love the guy and we're friends and we've been friends a long time. We got a history together.
Take my money. I'd come see that show, my friend.
But that would be fun for me. Yeah. So you're saying 2 other comics or 2 other anybody?
Yeah, 2 other comics that in that format that you would like to see do that, and then have a back and forth with Dave after doing a little comedy.
Probably one that would really be interesting in his heyday, because he was brilliant, was Jerry Lewis. And also controversial. And
sure.
If David would go toe to toe with him, because Jerry, I've seen him. I saw Phil Donahue one time try to grill him, and Jerry was brilliant. And and also they could talk about comedy and other things. But I think that would be an interesting. But I would love to see Dave in the past interview Johnny Carson for an hour.
Yeah, of course.
That would be. Because Dave had such great reverence for Johnny, and Johnny for him. But they weren't huggy guys. They weren't huggy guys, And Dave's not a huggy guy. I hug him, but it isn't like I'm a hugger, I'm
Me too.
I'm Irish Italian,
Does Dave tense up when you hug him?
Yeah, not so much now, but he used to. Years ago. There was a guy named Jimmy Wiggins who's passed away. Wiggins hugged stop signs. He hugged everybody. He just hugged. he just was a hugger, and everybody Tommy, and he'd hug, and everybody hugged. But David, this is when we were brand new. Wiggins would be coming towards us, and David would get behind me. He'd say, "Oh, he's gonna hug me. He's gonna hug me." But he's really changed through the years. But I went back to saying Johnny Carson and Dave going head to head for an hour would really be an interesting. If they let their guards on, that would be interesting. I think Jerry Lewis, because Jerry Lewis was a tough, strong, extremely intelligent guy.
Yeah.
And David and him, if they went toe to toe, that would be. And I don't mean animosity. I mean
no. It's that fencing. It's the fencing. It's the dance. Yeah.
I could probably, I would like to see him and George Miller. George was our dear friend, and David and George were real close. They when David first came to LA, he had a little tiny apartment, and George had one, like down the hall. They started out together. George was quick and sharp, and also would come back at Dave. Even when Dave was a big star, George would come back at him. That would be fun to see. But you're talking about somebody that's alive. I keep talking about dead people.
Hey man, I'm cool going down and talking about that too. I think it's great that we do that. We talk about passing of torches and whatnot. If somebody who listens to this goes and starts looking up goes down the rabbit hole and starts looking up George Miller, I think you and I have done a good night's work. So that's great. But yeah, if there is anybody current, or not current, but somebody who's still around now that could, because maybe we're booking a show here. You and I may be literally booking some sort of super show. I think there's an audience for that in this new format. It's called That's My Time with David Letterman. That's the show. Yourself on one. Who are two other guys that are alive? I'll tell
you something else though.
Yeah,
I would love to interview David Letterman. I would love, if he wouldn't let me.
The way Jerry did a couple of years ago. Seinfeld did that. Yeah.
I would love to, and not like comedians in a car and all that stuff. I'd like to sit down and really get in depth with him, how much he wanted to bare his soul. But I know him. I would love to do that. But I mean, he'd never do that. But nonetheless, it would. Yeah, I'm trying to think of other people that I would like to see him interview.
Or a comic, yeah.
I'd have to think about that.
Sure.
Whether it be a politician, whether it be, it's always fun to watch David interview people that he has great reverence for.
Yes.
But I'd like to see him interview somebody who he doesn't have reverence for, and not have to be polite, not have to be. And David is by nature polite.
Sure.
His demeanor is polite. He doesn't want to hurt anybody. He's, but I would like to see, that would be more fun for me, because he doesn't think he's as bright as he really is. He would never ever. I say he's an intellectual, but he's very smart, but he would never admit to that even,
we saw it.
David. That's a charm of David. That's why it's fun to be around him and everything. I usually, a lot of times I'll walk away with more knowledge than I came into that conversation, because he'll say something that I'll say, "Ooh, I never thought of it that way."
Yeah. Watching him a few weeks ago, it was a tremendous honor. I hadn't seen him on stage, obviously, since that night a month before he retired, when I had my moment there on the show and whatnot. And seeing that, when you describe Frank, when the spotlight hit him, suddenly 20 years melted away. I don't see Dave as an old guy anyway. And I mean, I know he called himself grandpa and does all that. When he was on stage and he came out to do that monologue, the love that was in that audience for him was it was palpable. You could feel it. The energy was amazing. But again, he's like a kid up there, a very smart kid, but a kid. And I think you're going to like that show, because when he was talking to these comics that he really didn't have a relationship with, they're up and coming comics, there was some very cool back and forth, and I'm very excited for this show. I'm very excited for God, man. It's a good time to be a David Letterman fan. He's back on the YouTube. I hope to see you and him on his YouTube channel at some point. Hopefully, Walter Kim can get you two together, and I think that'd be a lot of fun, because he's doing he's doing this long form stuff, but now he's also doing this little YouTube stuff with Mary and Barbara, and it's fun to see. I hope to see you and him, because you on panel with David Letterman, Tom, and again, it's not lip motion. One of my very, very favorite things when it comes to broadcasting. I loved it so much. And this has been a thrill. Before I kind of close it up here, is there anything else we didn't cover that we want to cover tonight?
I just want to say that,
yes, sir.
What the stand-up comedian is, and David, to me, exemplifies this, is that you remember the fable about the emperor and his clothing?
Yes, sir.
For those who are watching this and don't know that story, it's where the tailors were con men, and they convinced that everything they designed, only fools couldn't see it.
Yes.
So when they're designing this wardrobe for the king, and they're pretending they're putting this wardrobe, and they're saying, "Oh, how does that look?" Oh, he looks at, and the king's not going to say that he can't see it, because then he's a fool. So the tailors, that now the people around the king, they all come and say, "What do you think of the king's wardrobe?" "Oh, it's beautiful."
Yes.
Your Majesty.
There's the rub.
Now he's thinking, "Oh my God, I can't see," but I'm now pretty soon the whole kingdom's talking about it, and he's going to walk through the kingdom and show all the people his new wardrobe. So he's walking through with no wardrobe, and all the people in the crowd are doing the same. Oh, it's beautiful. And at the end of this is a little boy, and the little boy said, "He doesn't have any clothes on." And did you hear what that child said? Oh my! And the kid said, "He doesn't have any clothes on."
Mm-hmm.
And finally, an adult says, "You know something? I don't see any clothes either." And pretty soon it goes, that's who the comedian is. He exposes those who don't have any clothes on. And David Letterman exemplifies that to me. He's that little kid that would have said he doesn't have any clothes on. And that's what David brought to television. That kind of vulnerability, being vulnerable. A lot of people would say Frank Sinatra wasn't vulnerable. Bullshit. In a song, he was very vulnerable. Very vulnerable. But in the songs, but and that's who the great entertainers are. They're vulnerable, and David as a broadcaster was vulnerable. Anyhow, we can go on and on.
I couldn't have asked for a better ending. I'm gonna throw this out there. I wasn't gonna throw it out, but I'm going to. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the reverence and the love you have for your friend Dave. And I mean, I concede, even though I've got it in writing, I concede the best friend thing. I bow to you, sir, when it comes to that. When I asked you to be on the podcast, you had no reservations whatsoever, save for one. And you called Dave and you asked him if it was cool with him. And I can't tell you how much that made me appreciate you even that much more, Tom, because when you would come across you talk about comedians, and the only reason I'm bringing it up is you mentioned vulnerability. In my men's mental wellness podcast that I host, it comes up every episode, how men have a difficult time being vulnerable. And I just can't tell you how much I appreciate it. You on the screen, you seem like the guy on the other side of the screen is the same guy you see on the screen. And tonight you have absolutely solidified that truth in my mind. I hoped that would be the case, and it certainly is. The fact that you wanted to make sure that your friend was going to be cool with you doing this and getting the A-OK before you'd come on here, that impressed me that much more about you. Tom Dreesen, you are a hell of a guy. And I just appreciate this. You have made a dream come true for me. You were on my top 5 of people to be on the podcast here, on the Letterman Podcast. And I can't thank you enough. And hopefully one day you can come back on here. First and foremost, the community is going to want it, but even more so, I hope that we talked about you coming to Vancouver. If you ever come to Vancouver, I'm going to have a couple of books for you to sign and personalize to Mike. And it means the world to me that you would come on here and you would talk about your friend Dave. We're going to do our very best on this program to take all of these amazing stories, to archive them, solidify them, and pass them on to next generations, because we're talking about giants, and David Letterman is a giant. That's how we feel. Clearly, that's how you feel, even though, like, what's it like to be best friends with a giant? You've just given us a couple hours here talking about that. Tom, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I appreciate it very much. I appreciate what you're doing for my friend. And I know that one day, if he watches this, he will appreciate it too. But
we both know that's not going to happen, Tom.
He'll be embarrassed about the compliment. Anyhow, I got to run. You're going to end this, and then you and I have a couple second post talk.
Absolutely. Okay, so that's what we're doing right now. Hey, everybody, that is a very, very special episode of the Letterman Podcast. I can't thank you enough for being here and for the support that you've given me since starting this. I appreciate it so much. That's another episode of the Letterman Podcast. My name is Mike Chisholm. Thank you and good night.
Overcoat and underpants.